Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks very much to each of the expert witnesses. It's great to have you here and to have your insights. Can I just start with a question for Professor Kearney and Professor Staines? In presenting the Zero COVID strategy, you say that it's backed by science, experience and extensive analysis. Just in terms of the experience, are there examples of where this has been done? Is it New Zealand? Are there other places where it has been done and done successfully? And in practical terms, what would the implications be for people in Ireland if we were to pursue this strategy? One of the things that got a lot of coverage was the nature of life in New Zealand, for example, where there are large gatherings of people. Would that be the case in Ireland if we pursued this and successfully pursued it? Would, for example, would pubs be allowed to reopen? Would we have large music events and that type of thing? Or how would life on a practical basis be different for people in Ireland if we pursued successfully this strategy?
If we succeed, life would return to normal, except that if you travelled abroad and came back, you would almost certainly have to be tested and you would have to isolate for a period of time. How long that would be would depend on the final decisions about how you get tested, when you get tested, how often you get tested. That would be the main thing that members of the public would notice. Pubs would open, restaurants would open, Crow Park would open, the GAA would come back. We could have weddings, I could have my birthday party. All of this would come back to normal. And that is the plan, that's the desire. Businesses would be able to function as normal. Businesses would not have the awful uncertainty of, will we be locked down next week? Will we be locked down the week after next? So all of that would be gone away. So life would be substantially returned to normal, but foreign travel would still not be normal for at least some significant period of time, probably until there's a vaccine.
Okay.
And I suspect that will be the middle of next year, or even towards the end of next year. Okay, and
it was a point raised by Mr. O'Brien earlier in argument in relation to the approach, and is the one that we hear regularly, including from former Taoiseach and now Minister for Jobs, in opposition to this approach, is that Ireland isn't like New Zealand. We're a lot closer in physical terms, geographical terms, in economic terms to our nearest neighbours, to Europe, to the United States. Our economy is a very different one. How do you answer that question in terms of the interconnected nature of Irish society and our economy here compared to other places, and also the question of where does zero COVID end? Does it, the same as everything else, have to until or is it? Sorry, just getting some. Yeah, I'll question there. So in terms of the interconnected nature of the Irish economy, for Professor Kearney and Staines.
With that, New Zealand's economy is quite different to ours. They are largely a primary producing country with a very large amount of agriculture. And you're right, they have some advantages, as Professor Enan has pointed out. But there are countries, for example, Vietnam, which has a long land border with China, which has successfully brought COVID down to zero. Most parts of Australia have brought COVID down to zero. There is COVID in Victoria and there is COVID in New South Wales, but it's pretty much at zero everywhere else in Australia. South Korea has largely brought COVID down to zero. They have had a number of outbreaks which they dealt with. China, which is perhaps not a good example, it's a very different society, has brought COVID down to zero. And again, they've had 2 large outbreaks, one in Beijing and one in a town I can't pronounce by the Russian border. So this can be done. Our society is closely connected with Europe, but that does not have to mean closely physically connected. The technologies for interaction at a distance have greatly improved over the last year. And I think we're all becoming used to working.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Staines. I might move on to my next question to Professor Hennigan, if you can hear me okay. I took from your contributions that you have a difference of opinion in terms of the zero COVID approach. I wonder, given the fact that you work in the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine and have done a lot of work in terms of evidence synthesis, if you advocate an alternative approach and what that approach is.
Okay, thanks. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
Right. Look, what we see is often here is when people try to make points, they look for evidence. So, for instance, you just heard there about Vietnam. It's a classic fallacy. The median age structure in Vietnam is 30.5 years. The temperature, humidity, radically different. You haven't even understood whether they've got pre-existing infection cross-reactively from SARS-1, which they had them outbreaks. So when you get these issues that people say, here's the evidence, they did that, we're going to do this, I find that very difficult to understand from an evidence-based perspective. Second, we've heard about pubs. I think pubs are really interesting. People talk emotively about what we should do. You should close the pubs. Now, Ireland has 7,200 pubs. UK has 47,600 pubs. In the UK, we've had less than 10 outbreaks. So every pub is an outlier. And it's an opportunity to study what's going on. Yes, when people break the rules, you might have a quarantine. 2 weeks, you broke the rules, you're stopping. But some of them, we should be having an evidence-based approach, sample what's going on here. But what we get is a knee-jerk reactions of, let's close all pubs. I'll repeat my point. If you're going to go for a zero strategy, you need an effective vaccine in place now. Unless you're going to follow the New Zealand to the letter of the law. You're going to lock down, 14 days quarantine, and you're going to drive it out and not let any people in. There are no fudge factors. So the alternative viewpoint is to look to countries like Sweden, look to countries like Denmark, who are taking a much more sensible approach right now. Places like Denmark are not mandating masks. They're doing randomized controlled trials of masks. And that's due to be published soon. And I think if you go down this approach, what you have is a very intelligent mitigation strategy. I would look to the evidence for where we think significant transmission will happen before we have a vaccine. And I think there's some preliminary evidence about that, but I can't go into all of them now. But things like mass events, beyond the 50, 100 people, particularly indoors. So you look for them areas where you can make a difference versus the knee-jerk reaction, which is what we've seen in the UK. And one of the issues, for instance, is a very good example of that would be, for instance, the recent lockdowns in Leicester. And I think one of your colleagues alluded to that. Being clear about what's happening. In Leicester, a population of 340,000 people, just about, at the height of the epidemic, they had 45 admissions. When they locked down in July, they've had 7 admissions. So while detected cases were going up, remember that's not the same as cases, they had 7 admissions through the whole of July. And we're working on this. So what's particularly happening with the disease is not the same as what's happening when you go and detect cases. That strategy is there to do your test and trace system and manage them. So it's important when you think about lockdown, you think about COVID, its impact on morbidity and mortality, and not its impact on cases, which at the moment is detected cases are going up. That's not the same as cases, but actually the impact on disease, on admissions, critical care units and deaths are at a historic low level. And I'd watch that information to drive your policy as opposed to cases that are detected cases going up. And I'll tell you why this last point about why they're going up. If you look in the UK, they're picking up about 100 per 1,000 people. So in a daily basis, we're getting about 1,000 people a day. But if you look at the ONS survey data, that tells you the background rates in the UK is somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 people actually have the disease right now. So wherever you go and case detect, do more testing, you'll pick out what's in the background. What you shouldn't do is use that to get stressed and anxious and knee-jerk policy. You should do it to reflect and think what's working and what's not.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. I just have one final question for Professor Carney, please. There's a lot of agreement in relation to the need for testing capacity to be improved, that we have rapid and flexible testing. Do you have a sense or an indication? We have unused testing capacity at the moment. I'm inclined to think that that's an inappropriate situation to be in, but do you have a sense of what type of testing capacity would be required, how frequently specific cohorts would require to be tested and retested?
I think one of the things that's important to consider when we're talking about testing capacity is what capacity we're talking about, because there's lots of different steps in the process of testing. And so, you know, we saw things being rolled out in Croke Park, for example, in terms of actually taking the swabs, but then there's the getting those to the labs, there's the labs actually analysing those, and then there's the process of getting the results and acting appropriately on those. And so for me, at least, the really important thing when we're thinking about making sure that our testing capacity is appropriate is making sure that we're paying attention across all of that.
And we're not at the minute, because we have cases in Meath and in a creche, and I know people involved that have had to wait more than a week to have the test, contact trace and results back to them, and that's completely unsatisfactory at what is a relatively quiet time in terms of the demand on the system. I think that's something we can all agree that we need to improve upon. Thanks a million for your responses and your contributions.
Thank you, Deputy O'Rourke.